After his father, who was a secret trillionaire, died, his wife divorced him to marry his boss. Unaware he inherited a 120 real estate empire, what he did when her lover mocked him shocked her. The funeral had barely ended when Daniel Reed's wife, Catherine, handed him divorce papers in the lawyer's office, but she had no idea the man she was abandoning had just become one of the wealthiest individuals on the planet. His boss, Richard Ashford, stood beside Catherine with a smug expression, ready to claim the woman he'd been pursuing for months. But neither of them knew that Daniel's father, a janitor as far as anyone knew, had built an empire spanning 43 countries in complete secrecy. The $120 billion real estate portfolio included everything from Manhattan skyscrapers to entire islands in the Pacific. But Daniel had learned about his inheritance only moments before Catherine announced she was leaving him for the man who had spent years humiliating him at work. Richard mocked him right there in the mahogany-paneled room, laughing about how Catherine deserved a real man with a real future. But what Daniel did next would change everything Catherine thought she knew about success, power, and the biggest mistake of her life. Would Daniel reveal his newfound wealth immediately, or would he let them discover the truth in the most devastating way possible? Could Catherine live with herself once she realized she'd traded a $120 billion empire for a middle manager's salary? What would Richard's face look like when he discovered the man he'd tormented for years now owned the company where he worked? The rain hammered against the windows of Whitmore and Associates as Daniel Reed sat in the leather chair that still held the warmth of his father's absence. But the coldness in Catherine's eyes made the November storm feel tropical by comparison. She slid the papers across the table with manicured fingers that had once traced promises on his chest. But now those same hands belonged to Richard Ashford in everything except legal documentation. "Sign them, Daniel," Catherine said, her voice carrying the practiced indifference of someone who had rehearsed this moment. "We both know this marriage died years ago." Daniel stared at the divorce decree, but his mind was still processing what Jonathan Whitmore, his father's attorney, had revealed just 20 minutes earlier in the private conference room down the hall. His father, Thomas Reed, the man who had cleaned office buildings for 40 years, the man who wore the same 3 flannel shirts in rotation, the man who clipped coupons and drove a 1987 Honda Accord until the day he died, had been worth $120 billion. "Your father was extremely careful," Jonathan had explained, spreading documents across the table like a card sharp, revealing a winning hand. "He built his empire under 17 different holding companies, 73 shell corporations, and purchased properties through networks so complex that even the IRS never connected the dots. He started in 1979 with a condemned building in Detroit that he bought for $8,000, but he saw what others didn't: the coming revitalization, the patterns of urban development, the mathematics of gentrification." Daniel had listened in stunned silence as Jonathan outlined an empire that defied comprehension. His father owned the Ashford Tower where Daniel worked, but he also owned the building next to it and the one next to that. He owned 412 commercial properties in New York alone, but that was merely the beginning. There were shopping centers in California, office complexes in Texas, residential towers in Florida, and entire blocks of Chicago that paid rent to shell companies that ultimately funneled money into Thomas Reed's carefully constructed financial labyrinth. He owned 17 of the properties on Park Avenue, Jonathan continued, pulling out a map marked with red dots that looked like a rash spreading across Manhattan. He owned the hotel where you and Catherine had your wedding reception, but he also owned the restaurant where you proposed, the building where Catherine's parents live, and the hospital where you were born. The international holdings were even more staggering. Thomas Reed had purchased struggling properties during economic crises, buying when everyone else was selling, but he had done so with a patience and vision that bordered on prophetic. He owned office buildings in London, residential complexes in Tokyo, commercial districts in Singapore, and 3 entire islands in French Polynesia that he'd acquired during a banking crisis in the 1990s. "Why?" Daniel had asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why live like he lived if he had all this?" Jonathan had smiled sadly, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Your father believed that wealth attracted parasites, but poverty revealed character. He wanted to know who you truly were before you knew what you had. He wanted you to build your own strength, your own integrity, your own sense of self-worth without the corruption that comes from inherited wealth. He specified in his will that you were not to know about any of this until after his death, but he watched everything you did with tremendous pride." Now, sitting across from Catherine and Richard, Daniel understood his father's wisdom with crystalline clarity. Catherine had met him when he was an associate project manager at Ashford Real Estate Development, but she had fallen in love with his potential, not his person. She had loved the man she thought he would become, but when that future seemed to plateau, when promotions went to others, when Richard made it clear that Daniel would never rise beyond his current position, her love had evaporated like morning dew under a blowtorch. Richard Ashford stood behind Catherine with his hand possessively on her shoulder, but his expression carried the smugness of a man who believed he had won a competition that Daniel hadn't known they were having. Richard was everything Catherine wanted: ambitious, connected, powerful within the company hierarchy. He wore Tom Ford suits while Daniel wore off-the-rack Jaws. A bank, but what neither of them knew was that Daniel now owned Tom Ford's building on Madison Avenue, along with 47 other properties within a 6-block radius. "I'm doing you a favor, Reed," Richard said, his voice dripping with false magnanimity. "Catherine deserves someone who can provide for her, someone with a future, someone who isn't stuck in the same dead-end position year after year. You're 34 years old and you're still doing the same work you did when you were 26, but that's not her fault. Some men are built for success, and some men are built to watch success happen to other people." Daniel looked at Richard with new eyes, seeing not his boss, but a middle manager who earned $240,000 a year and thought himself a titan. Richard drove a leased BMW and lived in a rental apartment in Tribeca that cost $8,500 per month, but he acted like he owned Manhattan. The truth was that Daniel now owned the building where Richard lived, but he also owned the parking garage where Richard kept his car, and the restaurant where Richard took Catherine on dates he boasted about at the office. "Sign the papers, Daniel," Catherine repeated, and for the first time, Daniel heard the impatience beneath her practiced calm. "I've already moved my things out, but I left you the furniture since you'll need it. Richard and I are getting married next month in Turks and Caicos, and I'd like this to be finalized before then." Daniel picked up the pen, but he didn't sign immediately. Instead, he looked at Catherine, really looked at her, and saw a stranger wearing his wife's face. They had met at a charity function 6 years earlier, but she had pursued him with an intensity that had felt like destiny. She had been a marketing director at a pharmaceutical company, beautiful and accomplished, and she had chosen him. That validation had meant everything to a man who had grown up watching his father clean other people's offices. Their wedding had been modest by Catherine's standards, but expensive by Daniel's. They had honeymooned in Barcelona, but Catherine had complained about the hotel, the restaurants, the tours that Daniel could barely afford. She had wanted the presidential suite but settled for a standard room, and that settling had become the theme of their marriage. She settled for a 2-bedroom apartment instead of a townhouse, but she reminded him of this sacrifice regularly. She settled for Caribbean vacations instead of European ones, but she made sure he knew what she was giving up. She settled for him, but now she had found someone she believed required no settling at all. "Before I sign," Daniel said quietly, "I want to understand something. When did you decide it was over?" Catherine sighed, exchanging a glance with Richard that spoke volumes about their private conversations. Does it matter? We grew apart, Daniel. You became comfortable with mediocrity, but I wanted more from life. Richard offers me a partnership, but you offered me waiting. Always waiting for things to get better, for your next review, for your next opportunity, but nothing ever changed. I see, Daniel said, and he did. He saw everything with perfect clarity, the way Catherine had slowly withdrawn her affection, the way she had stopped asking about his day, the way she had begun staying late at work with increasing frequency. He saw the pattern now, the months of emotional preparation she had done before serving these papers, but he also saw something else. He saw the future she had chosen and the future she had rejected, and the gap between them was measured in billions. Richard checked his Rolex, a 42mm submariner that he wore like a badge of honor, but Daniel's father had owned a collection of 17 vintage Patek Philippe's that were collectively worth more than Richard would earn in 3 lifetimes. Can we move this along? Catherine and I have dinner reservations at Le Bernardin at 8, and I don't want to be late. Daniel signed the papers with steady hands, but his mind was already 3 moves ahead. He had learned chess from his father during long evenings in their small apartment, and Thomas Reed had taught him that the most devastating victories came from letting your opponent believe they were winning until the moment you revealed they had already lost. Congratulations, Daniel said, standing and extending his hand to Richard. I hope you'll both be very happy. Richard shook his hand with the grip of a man asserting dominance, but Daniel felt nothing except a distant pity. Catherine gathered the papers, relief evident in her posture, and Daniel wondered if she felt anything at all beyond eagerness to begin her new life. For what it's worth, Catherine said at the door, I did love you once. You were kind and thoughtful, and everything I thought I wanted, but I needed someone who wanted more from life. I hope you find someone who's satisfied with simple things, because you deserve to be happy too. They left together, Richard's hand on the small of Catherine's back, and Daniel watched them disappear into the elevator that would take them down 47 floors to the street level. He waited until the doors closed before pulling out his phone and calling Jonathan Whitmore. It's done, Daniel said. She signed. And you didn't tell her? Jonathan asked. No, Daniel replied. I have other plans, but I'll need your help implementing them. What did you have in mind? Daniel looked out the window at the Manhattan skyline, seeing it not as a collection of buildings, but as a portfolio he now controlled. My father spent 40 years building this empire in secret, but he did it with a purpose. He wanted to help people, to create opportunities, to make a difference without ego or recognition. I want to honor that, but I also want justice for every person Richard Ashford has humiliated, every employee he's underpaid, every dream he's crushed to feed his own ambition. Ambitious, Jonathan observed. What's your first move? Richard is planning to pitch a development project next week, the Riverside Towers project that's been in planning for 2 years. He thinks securing that project will cement his position for a vice presidency, but he doesn't know that I own the land through one of my father's holding companies. I want you to reject Ashford's bid and accept the counter-proposal from Harrison Development instead. Harrison is offering $20 million less than Ashford, Jonathan pointed out. I know, but Harrison actually cares about creating affordable housing units, while Richard's plan is luxury condos that will displace 1,500 families. My father didn't build his empire by stepping on people, and neither will I. Over the next 3 weeks, Daniel transformed his life with surgical precision, but he did it invisibly. He continued going to work at Ashford Real Estate Development, arriving at 8:15 a.m. and leaving at 5:30 p.m., but his evenings were now spent with Jonathan Whitmore and a team of financial advisors, learning to manage an empire that spanned continents. He studied his father's investment philosophy, reading through 40 years of handwritten journals that revealed a man of extraordinary intelligence and compassion. Thomas Reed had not simply bought properties, He had saved communities. When factories closed and towns died, Thomas Reed had purchased entire commercial districts at pennies on the dollar, but instead of flipping them for profit, he had renovated and leased them at below-market rates to local businesses. He had bought apartment buildings in gentrifying neighborhoods, but he had capped rent increases and created programs that helped long-time residents stay in their homes. He had acquired struggling shopping centers, but he had recruited minority-owned businesses and provided them with favorable lease terms that traditional landlords would never consider. Your father believed that wealth was a tool for social engineering, Jonathan explained during one of their evening sessions. He could have been worth $300 billion if he had maximized profits, but he chose to be worth $120 billion while actually improving the lives of the people in his properties. He wasn't a philanthropist in the traditional sense. He wasn't giving money away. He was using capitalism as a mechanism for equity, creating value while distributing it more fairly than the system typically allows. Daniel absorbed these lessons like a man discovering his true heritage, but he also watched Richard Ashford self-destruct in slow motion. The Riverside Tower's rejection had hit Richard like a freight train, and he had spent the last 2 weeks trying to understand how Harrison Development had secured a property that Ashford had locked up with exclusive negotiating rights. What Richard didn't know was that those rights had been with a shell company that Daniel now controlled, and Daniel had simply chosen to entertain competing bids. At the office, Richard's mood had turned toxic. He snapped at assistants, but he also began drinking at lunch and returning with bourbon breath that everyone pretended not to notice. He had told Catherine that the vice presidency was guaranteed, but now that promotion seemed to be slipping away, and the pressure was transforming him into a crueler version of himself. "Reed," Richard barked across the office floor one afternoon. "Get in my office now." Daniel walked into Richard's corner office, a space that overlooked Central Park, but Daniel now knew that the building itself was owned by Reed Enterprises through a holding company called Metropolitan Properties, LLC. Richard sat behind his desk with a tumbler of scotch, despite it being only 2:30 p.m., and his eyes held the desperate anger of a man watching his future collapse. "The Morrison account is threatening to pull out," Richard said. "They're saying our proposal doesn't meet their sustainability requirements, but that's your department. You're supposed to be handling the environmental impact assessments. So what the hell happened?" Daniel had indeed been handling those assessments, but he had also been honest about them. The Morrison account was a real estate investment trust looking to develop a waterfront property in New Jersey, but their plans included dumping construction waste in wetlands that served as a critical habitat for migratory birds. Daniel had documented this in his report, but Richard had told him to revise it to make the environmental impact seem negligible. "I gave you an accurate assessment," Daniel said calmly. "The project, as designed, violates 3 federal environmental statutes and 2 state regulations. Morrison is pulling out because they did their own due diligence and discovered what I told you in the first place. The project can't move forward without significant redesign." Richard stood, his face flushing red. "Your job isn't to do accurate assessments, Reed. Your job is to help us win clients. But you're so busy being morally superior that you cost us a $15 million contract. This is exactly why you'll never move up in this company. You don't understand that sometimes you have to bend the rules to succeed." "Bending the rules and breaking the law are different things," Daniel replied. "I won't sign my name to documentation that could result in criminal liability." "Then maybe you should find somewhere else to work," Richard shot back. "I've tolerated your Boy Scout routine because Catherine asked me to go easy on you, but she's with me now, and I don't owe you anything. You're fired, Reed. Clean out your desk and be gone by 5. Daniel had anticipated this moment, but he hadn't expected it to feel so liberating. "I'll need that in writing," he said quietly. "Excuse me?" Wrongful termination suits are expensive, but I'll need documented cause for my dismissal in writing before I leave." Richard's eyes narrowed, but he was smart enough to recognize a legal trap. "Get out of my office," he said instead. "You're on unpaid administrative leave pending review. We'll have HR contact you about next steps, but I'd start looking for a new job if I were you." Daniel returned to his cubicle and began packing his personal items into a cardboard box. A photo of his father, a coffee mug from Barcelona, a small plant that had somehow survived 3 years of fluorescent lighting. His co-workers avoided eye contact, familiar with Richard's rages, but Susan Chen from accounting stopped by his desk. "I'm sorry, Daniel," she said softly. "Richard's been impossible since the Riverside deal fell through, but taking it out on you isn't fair." "Don't worry about me," Daniel assured her. "Everything works out the way it's supposed to." That evening, Daniel met with Jonathan Whitmore and his father's core advisory team, 5 people who had helped Thomas Reed build his empire and had maintained their silence for 4 decades. There was Margaret Reynolds, a real estate attorney who specialized in complex transactions; David Park, a former IRS investigator who now structured tax-efficient holding companies; Lisa Washington, an urban planning expert who identified emerging markets; Robert Chen, a property manager who oversaw day-to-day operations across the portfolio; and Jonathan himself, who coordinated everything. "It's time to move forward with Phase 2, Daniel announced. "I want to acquire Ashford Real Estate Development." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "The entire company? That's a hostile takeover, Daniel. It'll be expensive, messy, and very public." "I know," Daniel replied. "But Ashford is a cancer in this industry. They've spent 15 years maximizing profits by cutting corners, exploiting workers, and destroying communities. My father would have shut them down years ago if he'd known what I know now. But he compartmentalized his holdings so thoroughly that he didn't realize he already owned many of the properties Ashford manages." David pulled up financial records on his laptop. "Ashford Real Estate Development is publicly traded with a market capitalization of $4.2 billion. But the founding family, the actual Ashfords, still hold 43% of shares. You'd need to acquire at least 51% to gain control, which means purchasing 8% from public shareholders and convincing the Ashford family to sell you their stake." "The Ashfords will never sell to a hostile buyer," Lisa pointed out. "Marcus Ashford founded the company in 1987, and his son Douglas runs it now. It's their legacy, but it's also their identity. They'd rather see the company fail than sell to someone who might change its direction." Daniel smiled. "What if I'm not a hostile buyer? What if I'm a concerned shareholder offering to rescue a struggling company with fresh capital and strategic vision?" "You don't own any Ashford shares," Robert observed. "Not yet," Daniel agreed. "But I will by tomorrow morning. David, I want you to set up a new holding company. Call it Riverside Investment Partners. Margaret, I want you to begin quietly purchasing Ashford shares through multiple brokerage accounts to avoid triggering disclosure requirements. We have 45 days before we hit the 5% threshold. That requires SEC filing, but I want to own 12% before anyone notices what's happening." Over the next 6 weeks, Daniel executed the most complex financial maneuver of his life, but he did so with the patient precision his father had taught him through chess and example. Riverside Investment Partners purchased Ashford shares in small increments through 17 different accounts, never buying enough at once to move the market price, but steadily accumulating a position that would shock the financial world. During this time, Catherine married Richard in Turks and Caicos, as planned. Daniel saw the photos on social media, Catherine in a flowing white dress on a beach at sunset, Richard in linen pants and a white shirt, both of them smiling with the confidence of people who believed they had escaped to something better. Catherine had posted a caption about new beginnings and finding someone who matches your ambition. And Daniel had liked the photo with genuine warmth. He bore Catherine no ill will. She had wanted a certain kind of life, and she had pursued it with clarity of purpose. The fact that she had miscalculated Daniel's trajectory wasn't malice, but merely short-sightedness. And Daniel had learned from his father that punishing people for being human was a waste of energy better spent on constructive action. Richard, however, was a different matter. Richard had spent years humiliating employees, crushing dreams, and using his position to bully people who couldn't fight back. He had told Daniel once during a company happy hour, after too many drinks, that kindness is weakness in business, but winners do whatever it takes to win. That philosophy had guided Richard's entire career, and Daniel intended to demonstrate exactly how wrong it was. The Ashford Family Emergency Board meeting was called for a Tuesday in mid-January, 6 weeks after Daniel had been placed on administrative leave. Douglas Ashford, the CEO, had discovered that someone had accumulated 12.7% of company shares, triggering mandatory SEC disclosure, but the owner was listed as Riverside Investment Partners, a newly formed entity with no history and no apparent connection to anyone in the industry. Daniel arrived at Ashford headquarters wearing a Tom Ford suit that had been his father's, navy blue with subtle pinstripes, fit perfectly after minor alterations. He carried a leather briefcase containing documents that would change everything, but his expression revealed nothing beyond polite professionalism. Security stopped him at the lobby. "I'm sorry, sir, but this is a private building. Can I help you find something?" "I'm here for the board meeting," Daniel said calmly. "Daniel Reed, representing Riverside Investment Partners." The security guard checked his tablet, confusion evident on his face. "I don't have you listed, Mr. Reed, but I'll call upstairs." 5 minutes later, Jonathan Whitmore emerged from the elevator with Douglas Ashford, a silver-haired man in his late 60s who carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to deference. Douglas's expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes showed calculation. "Mr. Reed," Douglas said, extending his hand, "this is unexpected, but I understand you represent our mysterious new shareholder. Please come up. We're eager to understand your intentions." The boardroom on the 47th floor overlooked Lower Manhattan, but Daniel noticed immediately that he could see 4 buildings he now owned from this vantage point. The board members sat around a mahogany table, 12 people representing various shareholders, including 2 Ashford family members and Richard Ashford, who had been promoted to the board 3 weeks earlier as part of Douglas's succession planning. Richard's face went through several expressions when Daniel walked in: confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally, rage. "What the hell is this? Daniel Reed is on administrative leave, but he doesn't represent any shareholders. He's a project manager who couldn't even keep his wife happy, let alone manage investments." "Actually," Jonathan Whitmore said smoothly, "Mr. Reed represents Riverside Investment Partners, which as of this morning owns 12.7% of Ashford Real Estate Development. Under corporate bylaws, any shareholder controlling more than 10% has the right to attend board meetings and address the board on matters of company direction." Douglas Ashford gestured to an empty chair. "Please sit, Mr. Reed. We're all very curious about your intentions, but we're also concerned about the aggressive manner in which these shares were accumulated. Normally, institutional investors reach out to management before acquiring such significant positions." Daniel sat, placing his briefcase on the table. "I apologize for any concern my investment has caused, but I wanted to understand the company thoroughly before engaging in dialogue about its future. I've spent the last 6 weeks reviewing Ashford's financials, development projects, property management practices, and long-term strategic plans, and I have to say, I'm troubled by what I've discovered." "Troubled?" Richard laughed harshly. "You were barely competent at your job, Reed, but now you're going to lecture us about company strategy. This is absurd." Let him speak, Richard, Douglas said quietly. Mr. Reed, please elaborate on your concerns. Daniel opened his briefcase and distributed folders to each board member. Ashford Real Estate Development has been profitable on paper for 15 consecutive years, but that profitability has come at tremendous cost to the communities you serve, the employees you exploit, and the long-term sustainability of your business model. You've maximized short-term gains by deferring maintenance, fighting tenant rights, suppressing wages, and engaging in development practices that border on criminal negligence. That's defamatory, Richard interjected. You can't make accusations like that without evidence? Daniel interrupted. The folders in front of you contain documented evidence of 47 code violations across Ashford properties that have been ignored for years, resulting in unsafe living conditions for over 3,000 tenants. You'll also find records of systematic wage theft affecting 273 employees, environmental violations at 4 construction sites, and falsified environmental impact assessments on 6 major projects, including the Morrison account that I was fired for refusing to falsify. The room fell silent. Board members opened their folders, faces growing increasingly pale as they reviewed the documentation that Daniel and his team had compiled. Where did you get this information? Douglas demanded. These are internal documents, some of which should be protected by attorney-client privilege. I have my sources, Daniel replied. But the question isn't where I got the information, it's what we're going to do about it. Ashford Real Estate Development is facing potential legal liability in the hundreds of millions of dollars, but you're also facing reputational destruction that could collapse your stock price overnight. However, I'm here to offer a solution. What kind of solution? Douglas asked warily. I'm prepared to purchase the Ashford family's 43% stake in the company for $7 billion, a 35% premium over current market value. In exchange, I gain controlling interest and implement immediate reforms to bring the company into compliance with all applicable laws and regulations, but I also transform Ashford into a model for ethical real estate development. Richard stood abruptly. This is extortion. You're using stolen documents to force a sale, but we'll sue you into oblivion for— Sit down, Richard, Douglas said softly, and the command in his voice was unmistakable. Richard sat, but his face had gone scarlet with rage. Douglas studied Daniel with new interest. $7 billion is a generous offer, Mr. Reed, but I'm curious about something. Who exactly are you? 6 weeks ago, you were on administrative leave from a project manager position, but now you're proposing to buy one of New York's largest real estate companies. Where did you acquire the capital to purchase 12.7% of our shares, let alone $7 billion more for the family stake? Daniel smiled. My father recently passed away, but he left me with certain resources that have allowed me to pursue opportunities I find meaningful. Your father, Douglas repeated slowly. Thomas Reed, the janitor who died in November. The very same. And he left you enough money to buy a real estate empire. Douglas's skepticism was evident. Mr. Reed, I appreciate creativity, but— Jonathan Whitmore slid a document across the table. This is a verified letter of credit from J.P. Morgan Chase, confirming that Riverside Investment Partners has immediate access to $9 billion in liquid capital, with additional credit lines available if needed. Mr. Reed's financial capacity is not in question. The board members passed the letter around, and Daniel watched their expressions transform from skepticism to shock to calculation. He had positioned himself perfectly. He held enough shares to be a serious problem if they rejected his offer, but he was offering a premium that the Ashford family would find very difficult to refuse. I need to discuss this with my family, Douglas said finally. This is a significant decision, but it's also an unexpected opportunity. Can you give us 48 hours to consider your proposal? Of course, Daniel agreed. But I should mention that if we can't reach an agreement, I'll have no choice but to file complaints with the appropriate regulatory agencies regarding the violations documented in those folders. I'd prefer to fix these problems quietly as an owner, but I can't allow them to continue unchallenged if I remain simply a minority shareholder. It was a threat delivered with perfect politeness, but everyone in the room understood the stakes. Richard looked like he wanted to explode, but Douglas silenced him with a glance. The board meeting adjourned, but as Daniel stood to leave, Richard blocked his path. "You think you're so clever, don't you? You think you can come in here and destroy everything I've built, but whatever tricks you're pulling, they won't work. I'll expose you for the fraud you are, and when Catherine realizes what a snake you've been, she'll what?" Daniel asked quietly. "Leave you." "Richard, Catherine made her choice with full information about who I was at that time. I harbor no resentment toward her, but I do wonder what she'll think when she realizes you've been managing properties owned by my companies without knowing it. 47 of Ashford's buildings are actually owned by shell companies in my father's portfolio, but you've been collecting management fees and treating the tenants terribly while paying rent to entities I control. That's going to be an interesting conversation." Richard's face went white. "You're lying." "Am I? Check the ownership records for the properties at 1247 Madison Avenue, 583 Park Avenue, and the Riverside Towers site you lost. Look at who actually owns the land, then trace the holding companies back to their source. You'll find that virtually every property you thought was an Ashford success story was actually built on land owned by Reed Enterprises." Daniel walked past Richard toward the elevator, but he paused at the threshold. "For what it's worth, Richard, I hope you and Catherine are happy together. You deserve each other, two people willing to sacrifice integrity for ambition, comfort for status, and kindness for power. My father taught me that how you build something matters as much as what you build, but you never learned that lesson. That's why you'll always be an employee while I'm about to become your employer." 48 hours later, Douglas Ashford called with his family's decision. They would sell their 43% stake for $7 billion, but they had one condition. Douglas would remain as CEO for a transitional period of 1 year to ensure continuity. Daniel agreed, understanding that he needed Douglas's expertise, but also knowing that he would reshape the company completely within that time frame. The acquisition was announced the following Monday, sending shockwaves through the real estate industry. Financial reporters struggled to understand who Daniel Reed was and where he had come from, but Jonathan Whitmore had prepared a carefully crafted narrative that emphasized Daniel's vision for ethical real estate development without revealing the full scope of his inherited empire. Catherine called Daniel 3 hours after the announcement broke, her voice tight with emotion. "Is it true? Did you really buy Ashford?" "I bought controlling interest, yes," Daniel confirmed. There was a long silence. "Your father was a janitor, Daniel. How is this possible?" "It turns out my father was very good at his job, but he also had other interests. He invested wisely over 4 decades, and he left me the results of that patience and discipline." "You knew," Catherine said, and Daniel heard the dawning realization in her voice. "When I gave you the divorce papers, you already knew you were rich." "I knew," Daniel confirmed, "but I also knew that telling you would have changed nothing except adding guilt to your decision. You wanted a different life, Catherine, and you pursued it honestly. I respect that." "I left you for Richard because I thought he had a future," Catherine said, and now her voice was breaking. "I thought you were going to be a middle manager forever, but you were already... God, Daniel, you must have thought I was so shallow." "I thought you were human," Daniel replied gently. "We all make decisions based on the information we have, but we also reveal our priorities through those decisions. You prioritized wealth and status, which is a valid choice, but it's not a choice I would have made. My father taught me that character is what you do when no one is watching and nothing is at stake. But he also taught me that who you are when everything is at stake reveals your deepest values. I made a mistake, Catherine whispered. I can see that now, but Daniel, is there any chance we could— No, Daniel said firmly but kindly. You're married to Richard, and I genuinely hope you build a good life together. But what we had is over, and it ended for reasons that still exist. You wanted someone who prioritized wealth and success above everything else, but I want someone who prioritizes integrity and compassion. We're fundamentally incompatible, and no amount of money changes that. Catherine was crying now. What are you going to do to Richard? He's terrified that you're going to fire him, but he needs this job, Daniel. We have a mortgage, and Richard will have the opportunity to keep his position if he can adapt to new management expectations, Daniel explained. I'm implementing comprehensive reforms at Ashford, but employees who demonstrate integrity, competence, and genuine care for our tenants and communities will thrive. Those who can't or won't adapt to ethical business practices will need to find opportunities elsewhere. Richard's future is entirely in his own hands. Daniel hung up and turned to face the wall of windows in his new office, Douglas Ashford's former office, which overlooked Central Park from the 47th floor. He had spent the last week meeting with every department at Ashford, learning the company from the ground up, but he had also begun implementing changes that would transform it completely. He created a tenant advocacy position in every building, empowering residents to report problems directly to management without fear of retaliation. He established a whistleblower protection program for employees, offering bonuses for identifying unethical practices. He raised wages for the lowest paid workers by 35% and instituted profit-sharing programs that gave employees direct stakes in the company's success. The reforms were expensive in the short term, but Daniel didn't care about quarterly earnings. He cared about building something sustainable, something that improved lives rather than extracting value from them. His father had shown him that ethical capitalism was possible, but it required patience, discipline, and a willingness to accept smaller profits in exchange for larger impact. Richard lasted 6 weeks under the new management structure. He simply couldn't adapt to a culture that valued transparency over manipulation, collaboration over domination, and long-term sustainability over short-term gains. He resigned on a Thursday afternoon, citing irreconcilable differences with new management philosophy, and Daniel accepted his resignation without comment. Catherine filed for divorce from Richard 3 months later. Daniel heard through industry gossip that Richard had lost his temper at a charity function, screaming at a waiter over a delayed drink order, and Catherine had finally seen in him what Daniel had seen all along, a small man who mistook cruelty for strength and aggression for ambition. But Daniel's focus was no longer on Catherine or Richard. He was too busy implementing his father's vision on a scale Thomas Reed had never attempted. Using the $120 billion empire as a foundation, Daniel began acquiring struggling properties in overlooked communities, renovating them thoughtfully, and creating mixed-use developments that served local needs rather than extracting maximum profit. He purchased a dying mall in Detroit and transformed it into a community center with affordable office space for small businesses, a public library, a health clinic, and apartments for seniors. He acquired a failed shopping center in rural Pennsylvania and converted it into a technical training facility that partnered with local manufacturers to create job opportunities. He bought an abandoned office building in Newark and renovated it into a business incubator for minority-owned startups. Each project was profitable in the long term, but none of them maximized short-term returns. Daniel accepted 6% annual returns when he could have demanded 12%, but he slept better knowing his wealth was building communities rather than destroying them. 2 years after acquiring Ashford, Daniel established the Thomas Reed Foundation with an initial endowment of $20 billion. The foundation's mission was simple but revolutionary: to demonstrate that capitalism could be a force for equity rather than extraction, that wealth could be a tool for empowerment rather than exploitation, and that business success and social responsibility were not contradictory goals but complementary values. The foundation funded affordable housing developments, small business loans for entrepreneurs in underserved communities, scholarship programs for first-generation college students, and research into sustainable urban development practices. But Daniel also used the foundation to acquire and forgive medical debt, purchase and cancel student loans, and create emergency relief funds for families facing eviction or foreclosure. The financial press called him the stealth philanthropist because his giving was so quiet and strategic that most beneficiaries never knew who had helped them. Daniel preferred it that way. His father had taught him that true generosity required no recognition, that the most meaningful help was given anonymously, and that ego was the enemy of genuine compassion. 3 years after the divorce, Daniel ran into Catherine at a charity gala, benefiting affordable housing initiatives in Brooklyn. She was there as a volunteer, working the registration table in a simple black dress, and when their eyes met across the room, Daniel saw something in her expression he had never seen during their marriage: genuine peace. "Hello, Daniel," she said when he approached. "I heard you were the sponsor for tonight's event, but I didn't realize you'd be here in person." "I try to attend when I can," Daniel replied. "It's important to connect with the work beyond just writing checks, but I'm impressed to see you volunteering. What brought you to affordable housing advocacy?" Catherine smiled sadly. "I spent 2 years after my divorce from Richard trying to figure out what mattered to me beyond money and status, and I realized I had wasted so much of my life chasing things that didn't actually make me happy. I went back to school for a master's in social work, but I also started volunteering with organizations that help families avoid eviction. It's rewarding in ways I never experienced in my old life." "That's wonderful," Daniel said, and he meant it. "How are you doing otherwise?" "I'm good," Catherine said. "Really good, actually. I'm dating someone, a public school teacher named Marcus who makes $47,000 a year and loves his job. He's kind and thoughtful and everything I should have valued from the beginning, but I guess I needed to learn the hard way that money doesn't make you happy if you're living without integrity." They talked for another 20 minutes. Two people who had once promised forever but had discovered they were on fundamentally different journeys. There was no romantic tension, no lingering what-ifs, just two people who had grown into better versions of themselves through different paths. As Daniel drove home that night through Manhattan streets that contained dozens of buildings he owned, he thought about his father's greatest gift, not the $120 billion, not the empire spanning 43 countries, but the wisdom to understand that wealth without purpose was just elaborate poverty. Thomas Reed had lived as a janitor while owning buildings worth billions because he understood that identity came from what you did with your life, not what you possessed. He had cleaned offices to stay connected to the people his properties served, to remind himself daily that behind every rent payment was a human being with dreams and struggles and dignity that deserved respect. Daniel pulled up to his apartment, a modest 3-bedroom in Brooklyn that he had chosen specifically because it was in one of his father's buildings, a property his father had purchased in 1983 and maintained beautifully for 40 years. The super, Mrs. Rodriguez, was sweeping the front steps despite it being nearly 10 p.m. "Working late, Mrs. Rodriguez?" Daniel asked. She smiled. "Always something to do, Mr. Reed, but I don't mind. This is the best building I've ever worked in. Good tenants, good maintenance, good owner. Whoever owns this place really cares about keeping it nice." "I'll pass along your compliments," Daniel said, knowing he would never tell her that he was that owner. He climbed the stairs to his apartment and stood at the window overlooking Brooklyn, seeing not buildings but communities, not properties but homes, not investments but lives his father had touched through 40 years of patient, invisible generosity. What Richard Ashford had never understood was that true power wasn't about dominance, but about service, that real success wasn't measured in quarterly earnings, but in lives improved, and that the most devastating victories were the ones where your opponents never realized they were fighting a battle they had already lost. Catherine had divorced him to marry his boss, unaware he had inherited a $120 billion real estate empire. Richard had mocked him in that lawyer's office, laughing at the man he would soon be working for. But what shocked Catherine most wasn't the wealth Daniel had concealed. It was the realization that he would have been extraordinary with or without money, because his character had been forged in his father's image, and Thomas Reed had taught his son that how you treat people when you have nothing reveals who you are when you have everything. Daniel picked up the phone and called Susan Chen, the accountant from Ashford who had shown him kindness during his firing. She now ran the foundation's financial department but was also overseeing a new initiative Daniel had been developing. "Susan, it's time to move forward with the employee ownership program. I want to transfer 15% of Ashford's equity to current employees through a worker cooperative structure. But I want it structured so that the employees who've been with the company longest and earn the least receive the largest shares." "That's going to reduce your controlling interest," Susan pointed out. "You'll own only 41% after the transfer." "I know," Daniel said, "but my father didn't build this empire to consolidate power. He built it to distribute opportunity. The people who clean our buildings, maintain our properties, and serve our tenants deserve to share in the value they create, but they also deserve a voice in how the company operates." This is what he would have wanted. As Daniel hung up and prepared for bed, he thought about the journey that had brought him here, from a modest project manager watching his marriage dissolve to a man controlling an empire larger than most nations' GDP. But the journey that mattered wasn't measured in dollars or properties. It was measured in the slow, patient work of becoming the man his father had believed he could be. Richard Ashford had mocked him for being stuck in the same position year after year, but what Richard had never understood was that some men build their character in obscurity so they're ready when opportunity arrives, while others chase success so desperately that they become hollow versions of themselves, incapable of handling real power when they finally grasp it. Catherine had left him for someone with a bigger future, but she had failed to recognize that the future isn't something you pursue. It's something you build through daily choices about who you want to become. She had chosen wealth over integrity, status over compassion, and ambition over character, but she had discovered too late that those choices had cost her everything that actually mattered. Daniel fell asleep that night in his modest Brooklyn apartment, surrounded by his father's books and journals, knowing that tomorrow he would wake up and continue the work. Thomas Reed had started 40 years earlier, the patient, invisible work of building an empire that served people rather than exploiting them. That created opportunity rather than extracting value, and that proved beyond doubt that capitalism could be a force for good if guided by integrity, compassion, and an unshakable commitment to treating every human being with the dignity they deserved. The $120 billion empire wasn't Daniel's greatest inheritance. The wisdom to use it well, that was the true gift his father had left him, and Daniel intended to honor that gift by spending every remaining day of his life proving that wealth without purpose was just elaborate poverty, but wealth wielded with compassion could transform the world. 5 years had passed since that rainy November afternoon when Daniel Reed signed divorce papers in a lawyer's office, but the man who now stood before the United Nations General Assembly bore little resemblance to the quiet project manager who had once accepted humiliation as the price of employment. "Ladies and gentlemen," Daniel began, his voice steady as it carried across the chamber filled with representatives from 193 nations. I'm here today not as a billionaire or a real estate developer, but as my father's son. Thomas Reed spent 40 years proving that capitalism and compassion are not opposing forces, but he did it in secret because he believed that true generosity required no audience. I'm breaking that silence today because the world needs to understand what he discovered, that we can build wealth while building communities, that we can generate profit while generating opportunity, and that the choice between financial success and social responsibility is a false choice perpetuated by people who profit from inequality. The Thomas Reed Foundation had grown exponentially in 5 years, but its impact had grown even faster. Daniel had transferred 60% of his personal wealth into the foundation's endowment, creating a perpetual engine for social change that would outlive him by centuries. The foundation now operated in 73 countries, but its model remained consistent: acquire struggling properties, renovate them thoughtfully, and create mixed-use developments that served local needs while generating sustainable returns. In Detroit, the foundation had transformed 37 abandoned buildings into a thriving innovation district that housed 243 small businesses. But 70% of those businesses were owned by residents who had lived in the neighborhood for more than 10 years. In rural Appalachia, the foundation had purchased 14 dying coal towns and converted them into renewable energy hubs, retraining miners as solar panel installers and wind turbine technicians while preserving community identity. In inner-city Baltimore, the foundation had acquired a failed shopping mall and transformed it into a combined community college, medical clinic, and affordable housing complex that served 8,000 people daily. Each project followed the same principle: create value by serving people rather than extracting from them. The foundation accepted returns of 4 to 6% when traditional developers demanded 12 to 15%. But that patience had generated something far more valuable than quarterly earnings. It had generated proof that ethical capitalism worked. Catherine sat in the audience, watching Daniel present data showing that the foundation's properties had lower vacancy rates, higher tenant satisfaction scores, and more stable long-term returns than comparable properties managed for maximum profit. She had been invited as a representative of the New York Coalition for Affordable Housing, an organization where she now served as executive director, but she attended primarily because she needed to see this moment with her own eyes. Beside her sat Marcus Chen, her husband of 3 years and the public school teacher who had shown her that wealth measured in love and purpose far exceeded wealth measured in bank balances. They held hands as Daniel explained how the foundation had forgiven $4.2 billion in medical debt for 1.7 million families, but he had done so anonymously until today because his father had taught him that public charity often served the giver's ego more than the recipient's needs. I've been criticized, Daniel continued, for wasting my inheritance on social programs that could have generated higher returns through traditional development. But I've come to understand what my father knew instinctively, that the highest return isn't measured in dollars but in lives transformed, communities preserved, and opportunities created. The foundation's properties are worth $73 billion today, but the real value lies in the 437,000 jobs created, the 612,000 housing units made affordable, and the 941,000 small businesses supported through favorable lease terms and microfinance programs. Richard Ashford watched the speech from his apartment in Queens, nursing a bourbon that had become his constant companion since his third marriage collapsed 6 months earlier. He had started 4 businesses in the 5 years since leaving Ashford Real Estate Development, but each one had failed because Richard had never learned the lesson Daniel was articulating to the United Nations. that sustainable success required treating people as partners rather than resources to be exploited. Richard's phone buzzed with a message from his lawyer. The bankruptcy proceedings were finalized, but Richard would need to sell his apartment and move into something far less expensive. The apartment he was losing, ironically, was owned by one of Daniel's holding companies, though Richard had never known it. Daniel had kept the rent below market rate for 5 years, believing that even people who had wronged him deserved basic dignity, but Richard had never questioned why his luxury apartment cost 30% less than comparable units. At the UN, Daniel was concluding his presentation. My father left me $120 billion, but his greater gift was teaching me that wealth is a tool, not a destination. I've spent 5 years trying to honor his legacy by demonstrating that business can be a force for equity rather than extraction, but I can't do this alone. That's why the Thomas Reed Foundation is announcing a new initiative today, the Global Partnership for Ethical Development. The screens behind Daniel displayed a comprehensive framework for transforming real estate development worldwide. The foundation would partner with governments, NGOs, and private developers to create mixed-use communities that prioritized sustainability, affordability, and community ownership. The foundation would provide technical expertise, initial capital, and ongoing support, but each project would be designed to transfer ownership to local residents within 20 years. We're committing $40 billion to this initiative over the next decade, Daniel announced. But we're not doing this as charity. We're doing this as investment in a future where housing is a human right, rather than a commodity, where communities control their own development rather than being displaced by it, and where capitalism serves human flourishing rather than demanding human sacrifice. The General Assembly erupted in applause, but Daniel felt his father's presence in that moment as clearly as if Thomas Reed were standing beside him. His father had started with an $8,000 condemned building in Detroit, but he had understood even then that every property represented an opportunity to improve lives. 46 years later, his son was taking that philosophy global. After the speech, Daniel returned to his hotel suite where Margaret Reynolds, David Park, Lisa Washington, Robert Chen, and Jonathan Whitmore were waiting with champagne. This was his father's original team, the 5 people who had helped Thomas Reed build an empire in secret, but they had become Daniel's family in the 5 years since his father's death. Your father would be proud, Jonathan said quietly, raising his glass. He spent 40 years building the foundation, but you've spent 5 years showing the world what it was for. That took courage he never had to demonstrate because he chose invisibility. He chose invisibility because he understood something I'm still learning, Daniel replied. That the work matters more than the recognition, that impact matters more than credit, and that the people you help should never become props in your own story of generosity. His phone rang, an unknown number, but Daniel answered anyway. Mr. Reed, this is Douglas Ashford. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Daniel smiled. Douglas had retired from Ashford Real Estate Development 3 years earlier, but he had spent his retirement studying the foundation's model and writing a book about ethical business practices that had become required reading in MBA programs worldwide. Douglas, it's good to hear from you. What can I do for you? I wanted to tell you that I watched your UN speech, and I also wanted to apologize. When you first came to our board meeting 5 years ago, I thought you were an upstart trying to destroy what my father built, but I've come to realize you were actually trying to save it. Ashford Real Estate Development is more profitable now than it ever was under my management, but more importantly, it's something I can be proud of. You showed me that my father's legacy didn't have to be built on exploitation, and that's a gift I can never adequately repay. You don't owe me anything, Daniel said, but I appreciate you calling. How's the book doing? It's been adopted by 47 business schools, Douglas said with evident pride. and I'm getting speaking requests from companies that want to transform their cultures. It turns out there's enormous hunger for a different model of capitalism, but people needed to see proof that it actually works before they'd take the risk. After hanging up, Daniel walked to the window overlooking Manhattan, seeing the city his father had quietly transformed over 4 decades. Thomas Reed had owned pieces of this skyline worth billions, but he had lived modestly because he understood that identity came from what you did with your life, not what you possessed. Daniel's phone buzzed again, this time a text from Catherine. "That was beautiful, Daniel. Marcus and I are so proud of you, but I also wanted you to know that I'm grateful for how you handled everything 5 years ago. You could have humiliated me or Richard, but you chose grace instead. That taught me more about character than anything else in my life, and it's shaped the person I've tried to become. Thank you for that gift." Daniel texted back, "You found your own path to integrity, Catherine. That's something to celebrate, not apologize for. I hope you and Marcus are happy." "We are," she replied, "but I also hope you find someone who deserves you. You've spent 5 years building your father's vision, but you deserve someone to share that journey with." Daniel smiled at the message but didn't respond. He had dated occasionally over the past 5 years, but no relationship had progressed beyond a few months, because Daniel had discovered that wealth complicated everything. Women either wanted him for his money or were intimidated by it, but very few seemed interested in the person beneath the portfolio. There was one exception, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a public health researcher he had met 18 months earlier at a foundation event. She had been presenting research on housing instability and health outcomes, but she had no idea who Daniel was beyond someone from the foundation. They had talked for 3 hours about urban planning, social determinants of health, and the challenge of creating sustainable change in complex systems. They had been dating quietly for 16 months, but Sarah still didn't know the full scope of Daniel's wealth. She knew he worked for the Thomas Reed Foundation in some kind of leadership role, but she assumed he was a well-paid executive, not the founder and primary funder. Daniel had kept this secret not because he was being deceptive, but because Sarah's genuine interest in him as a person, rather than a portfolio, was precious beyond measure. He called her now, knowing she would be finishing her shift at the community health clinic in Brooklyn, where she volunteered 2 days per week despite having a full-time position at Columbia University. "Hey," Sarah answered, her voice warm despite obvious fatigue. "How did the UN thing go?" "It went well," Daniel said, "but I need to tell you something important. Can we have dinner tonight?" "Of course. Should I be worried?" "No," Daniel assured her, "but there are things about my life that I haven't been fully honest about, and you deserve to know the truth." They met at a small Italian restaurant in Brooklyn, the same restaurant where they had their first date, a modest place with checkered tablecloths and a menu that hadn't changed in 30 years. Daniel had chosen it originally because Sarah had mentioned loving their pasta carbonara, but he had kept returning because it was one of the few places where no one recognized him or treated him differently because of his wealth. Over dinner, Daniel told Sarah everything about his father's secret empire, about Catherine's divorce, about Richard's mockery, about the $120 billion inheritance, and about the 5 years he had spent trying to honor his father's vision. He told her about the foundation, about the global initiative, and about the fact that he personally owned or controlled properties worth over $90 billion. Sarah listened in silence, her expression unreadable, and Daniel felt his heart constricting with fear that this revelation would destroy what they had built together. But when he finished, Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. "Are you disappointed that I didn't tell you sooner?" Daniel asked. Sarah smiled. "I'm relieved that you waited. If you had told me on our first date that you were worth $90 billion, I would have assumed you were either lying or insane, but I also would have questioned everything about our relationship. By waiting, you gave me the chance to know you as Daniel, The guy who volunteers at community gardens, who remembers my coffee order, who listens to my research presentations, even though they're boring, and who genuinely cares about making the world better. That person is who I fell in love with, but the money is just context for understanding the scale of what you're trying to accomplish. You're not angry? I'm processing, Sarah admitted. This is a lot to absorb, but I'm also grateful that you trusted me enough to share this. Can I ask you something, though? Anything. Why do you live in a 3-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn when you could buy any property in the world? Daniel smiled. Because that apartment is in one of my father's buildings, and living there keeps me connected to his original vision. The super Mrs. Rodriguez has worked there for 23 years, but she still doesn't know I own the building. Every time I see her taking pride in maintaining the property, I remember why my father did this. Not for recognition or gratitude, but because creating beautiful, well-maintained, affordable housing is its own reward. Sarah squeezed his hand. Your father sounds like he was an extraordinary man. He was, Daniel agreed. But he was also lonely in ways I'm only beginning to understand. He built this empire in complete isolation because he believed that sharing his wealth would corrupt the people around him. I don't want to make that mistake, but I also don't want to become someone who uses wealth as a shield against genuine human connection. Then don't, Sarah said simply. Be Daniel Reed, the person who happens to have resources, not Daniel Reed, the billionaire who happens to be a person. Keep living in Brooklyn, keep volunteering at community gardens, and keep treating the work as more important than the wealth. That's who you are, but that's also who I love. 3 years later, Daniel and Sarah were married in a small ceremony at the Brooklyn building where Daniel lived. Mrs. Rodriguez catered the reception, still unaware that the groom owned the property, but thrilled that such a nice young couple had chosen to celebrate in the community room she maintained so carefully. Catherine and Marcus attended, bringing a gift they had made together, a photo album documenting the transformation of properties in Catherine's affordable housing coalition, many of which had been supported by foundation grants that Catherine had secured without knowing Daniel was personally reviewing her proposals. Douglas Ashford sent a letter of congratulation along with a donation to the foundation in honor of the wedding, but he also sent something more personal, a framed photograph of Thomas Reed from 1979, standing in front of that first condemned building in Detroit. On the back, Douglas had written, "Your father understood something most people never learn, that wealth is a tool for building community, not a weapon for dominating it. Keep building, Daniel. The world needs more people who understand what your father knew." Richard Ashford did not attend the wedding, but he had sent a brief email 6 months earlier. "I've been in recovery for alcoholism for 2 years now, and part of that process involves making amends to people I've harmed. I can't undo the cruelty I showed you, but I want you to know that watching what you've built has taught me more about success than anything else in my life. I spent 20 years chasing wealth and status, but I ended up broke and alone because I never learned what you understood instinctively, that how you treat people defines who you are far more than what you accomplish. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that your example has helped me become a better person. Thank you for that." Daniel had written back immediately, "Richard, recovery takes tremendous courage, and I'm proud of the work you're doing. The foundation is starting a job training program for people in recovery, and if you're interested, I'd love to have you involved. Your experience and hard-won wisdom could help others avoid the mistakes you've made. No pressure, but the offer stands." Richard had joined the program 3 months later, starting as a volunteer counselor but eventually becoming the program director. He earned $48,000 per year, but he told Daniel during one of their quarterly check-ins that it was the first job where he felt genuinely proud of his work rather than just proud of his salary. 10 years after Thomas Reed's death, Daniel stood in that same Detroit property where his father had started. the condemned building purchased for $8,000 that had become the Foundation's international headquarters. The building had been transformed into a stunning example of adaptive reuse, combining office space for the Foundation's growing staff with affordable housing units, a community health clinic, a business incubator for local entrepreneurs, and a museum documenting Thomas Reed's 40-year journey from janitor to secret trillionaire. The museum had been Sarah's idea. She had argued that Thomas Reed's story needed to be told not as inspiration porn for billionaires, but as a demonstration that patient, strategic, ethical investment could generate both profit and social transformation. The museum featured interactive exhibits showing how Thomas had identified emerging markets, how he had structured his holdings to avoid detection, and how he had balanced financial returns with social impact. But the museum's centerpiece was a recreation of Thomas Reed's small apartment, the modest space where he had lived for 40 years despite being worth billions. Visitors could see his simple furniture, his carefully organized closet containing those 3 flannel shirts, his kitchen table covered with maps and property records, and his journals documenting 4 decades of careful investment guided by unwavering principles. Next to the apartment recreation was a quote from one of Thomas's journals, dated 1995. Made $47 million this year from property sales in California, but the money means nothing compared to knowing that 2,100 families have stable housing they can afford. True wealth isn't what you accumulate, it's what you enable others to build. I'm rich not because I have billions, but because I've helped thousands of people create stable lives for their families. That's a return on investment no quarterly earnings report could ever capture. Daniel stood in front of that quote with Sarah beside him and his 3-month-old daughter, Emma Thomas Reed, sleeping in his arms. He had named her after his father because he wanted her to carry forward the legacy of patient, purposeful, ethical wealth creation that Thomas had pioneered. "What do you think he would say if he could see all this?" Sarah asked, gesturing to the museum, the headquarters, and the global network of properties that now served over 2 million people across 73 countries. "I think he would say I'm being too public about it," Daniel replied with a smile. "But I also think he would understand that his strategy of complete invisibility worked for his generation, but not for ours. People need to see proof that ethical capitalism works, but they also need models to follow. By sharing his story and the Foundation's results, we're giving people permission to pursue profit and purpose simultaneously." Emma stirred in his arms, her small hand grasping Daniel's finger with the unconscious strength of new life. He looked at his daughter and wondered what world she would inherit, not just the wealth he would pass down, but the systems and structures that would shape her life. "I'm going to tell her stories about her grandfather," Daniel said quietly, "about how he cleaned offices while owning the buildings, about how he clipped coupons while being worth billions, about how he understood that wealth was a tool for service rather than domination. But I'm also going to tell her that the work isn't finished, that every generation has to choose whether to use their resources to build walls or bridges, to concentrate power or distribute it, to extract value or create it." Sarah kissed him softly. "She's lucky to have you as a father, but she's also lucky to have Thomas Reed's example to guide her. Not every child inherits billions, but every child deserves to inherit the belief that their life can matter, that their choices can create change, and that wealth, however large or small, is an opportunity to serve rather than be served." 25 years after that rainy November afternoon, when Catherine had handed Daniel divorce papers, Daniel Reed stood before the same United Nations General Assembly, but this time he was introducing his daughter Emma, who at 25 years old had become the Foundation's chief operating officer and its driving force for innovation. Emma presented data showing that the Global Partnership for Ethical Development had transformed real estate practices in 143 countries, but more importantly, it had created replicable models that proved ethical capitalism generated superior long-term returns precisely because it prioritized human flourishing over quarterly earnings. My grandfather started with $8,000 and a vision, Emma told the assembly. My father transformed that vision into a global movement, but the work isn't finished because poverty, inequality, and housing instability still affect billions of people worldwide. However, we now have proof, decades of data showing that when you treat housing as a human right, rather than a commodity, when you treat employees as partners rather than resources, and when you treat communities as stakeholders rather than markets, everyone benefits. Tenants have stable housing, employees have meaningful work, communities have sustainable development, and yes, investors still generate returns. The returns are smaller but more stable, more sustainable, and infinitely more meaningful because they're built on a foundation of shared prosperity rather than extracted value. Daniel watched his daughter present with the same pride Thomas Reed must have felt watching Daniel sign those divorce papers without revealing his inheritance. Understanding that character forged in obscurity created strength that wealth could never corrupt. Catherine sat in the audience again, now 62 years old but still beautiful, in the way that comes from lives lived with purpose rather than lives spent pursuing appearance. Marcus had died 3 years earlier from cancer, but Catherine had honored his memory by establishing a scholarship fund for children of public school teachers, a fund that the Thomas Reed Foundation had quietly matched dollar for dollar without telling Catherine until the program's 5th anniversary. Richard Ashford had died 7 years earlier, but he had died sober and at peace, having spent his final decade helping hundreds of men in recovery rebuild their lives. Daniel had attended Richard's funeral and had spoken about redemption, about how people could change if given the chance, and about how Richard's journey from arrogant executive to humble servant had taught Daniel that grace was always more powerful than judgment. After Emma's presentation concluded, Daniel returned to his Brooklyn apartment, the same 3-bedroom space where he had lived for 30 years despite being worth over $200 billion. Mrs. Rodriguez, now 87 years old, still maintained the building with the same care she had shown for 4 decades, but she had finally learned that Daniel owned the property. "Why didn't you tell me?" she had asked, when the truth emerged during a profile in the New York Times 5 years earlier. "Because you treated me like a neighbor rather than a landlord," Daniel had explained. "That was precious to me, but it was also what my father wanted, to be seen for who he was rather than what he owned. By not telling you, I got to experience what he experienced, genuine human connection untainted by wealth." Mrs. Rodriguez had hugged him then, tears streaming down her face. "Your father was the best landlord I ever had, but he was also the kindest man I ever met. He used to help me carry groceries, fix things in my apartment, and always remembered my grandchildren's names. I thought he was just a nice janitor, but he was actually—" She couldn't finish the sentence, overwhelmed by the scope of the deception and the beauty of its purpose. Now, 30 years after his father's death, Daniel sat in that same apartment with Emma and her husband James, a public defender who earned $55,000 per year and thought himself rich because he loved his work. They were discussing the Foundation's next initiative, a global program to eliminate homelessness in 50 cities over 20 years by creating permanent supportive housing that combined affordable units with comprehensive social services. "It's going to cost $40 billion, Emma explained, but the data shows that permanent supportive housing costs less than emergency services, incarceration, and hospitalization, so it's actually a better investment than our current approach of managed homelessness. More importantly, it's the right thing to do, but it's also profitable if you're patient enough to measure returns in decades rather than quarters." Daniel listened to his daughter articulate principles his father had pioneered 40 years earlier, and he understood with perfect clarity that Thomas Reed's greatest legacy wasn't the wealth he had accumulated, but the values he had demonstrated, that patience was more powerful than aggression, that service was more meaningful than dominance, and that the highest return on any investment was measured in lives transformed rather than dollars extracted. "Do it," Daniel said. "Your grandfather would approve, but more importantly, it's what we're here to do. The foundation exists to prove that capitalism can be redemptive rather than destructive, but that requires us to consistently choose long-term impact over short-term profit. If we can eliminate homelessness while generating sustainable returns, we'll have created a model that can be replicated globally." As Emma and James left to begin working on the implementation strategy, Daniel stood at his window overlooking Brooklyn and thought about the journey that had brought him here. From a project manager watching his marriage collapse, to a man who had transformed his father's secret empire into a global movement for ethical capitalism. He thought about Catherine, who had chosen ambition over integrity, but had found her way back to purpose through pain and reflection. He thought about Richard, who had chosen cruelty over kindness, but had discovered redemption through recovery and service. He thought about Douglas Ashford, who had inherited a company built on exploitation, but had transformed it into a model of ethical business practices. But mostly he thought about his father, Thomas Reed, the janitor who had been worth billions, the man who had cleaned other people's offices while owning the buildings, the visionary who had understood that wealth was a tool for building community rather than a weapon for dominating it. After his father's death and Catherine's divorce, Daniel could have destroyed Richard with a word, humiliated Catherine with a revelation, or used his wealth as a cudgel to punish everyone who had underestimated him. But his father had taught him something more powerful than revenge, that grace was stronger than judgment, that redemption was always possible, and that the most devastating response to cruelty was not more cruelty, but rather the persistent demonstration that kindness, integrity, and compassion ultimately generated better outcomes for everyone. What Daniel had done when Richard mocked him hadn't shocked Catherine because it was cruel or vindictive. It had shocked her because it was merciful, because Daniel had chosen to build something beautiful rather than destroy something ugly, because he had chosen to create opportunity rather than extract revenge, and because he had understood what Catherine had spent years learning, that how you respond to betrayal reveals your character far more than the betrayal reveals the character of those who wronged you. The sun set over Brooklyn, casting golden light across buildings that housed thousands of families living in stable, affordable housing because Thomas Reed had believed that wealth was a tool for service. Daniel picked up his phone and called the foundation's headquarters in Detroit. "This is Daniel Reed," he said when the night manager answered. "I'd like to increase our quarterly grant distribution by 15% to accelerate our timeline on the homelessness initiative. Can you make sure Emma gets that authorization first thing tomorrow morning?" "Of course, Mr. Reed," the manager replied. "Is there anything else?" "Yes," Daniel said quietly. "Make sure the increase is allocated to programs serving families with children first. My father always believed that investing in children was investing in the future, but he also believed that every child deserved stable housing as a foundation for building their lives. Let's honor that belief with action, not just words." As Daniel hung up and prepared for bed in his modest Brooklyn apartment, surrounded by his father's books and journals, living in a building his father had purchased 43 years earlier for $200,000 and had maintained beautifully ever since, he understood with perfect clarity that he had inherited something far more valuable than $120 billion. He had inherited the knowledge that wealth without purpose was just elaborate poverty, that success without integrity was just decorated failure, and that the highest calling of any human life regardless of financial circumstances, was to leave the world better than you found it by treating every person with the dignity, compassion, and respect they inherently deserved. That was Thomas Reed's true legacy, but it was also the gift he had given his son. Not money, but meaning. Not power, but purpose. Not dominance, but the patient, persistent, revolutionary belief that capitalism could be a force for equity if guided by people who understood that how you build something matters infinitely more than what you build. And in the end, that understanding, that fundamental commitment to building wealth that served rather than dominated, was what had truly shocked Catherine when she discovered what Daniel had inherited. Not the dollars, but the dignity. Not the empire, but the integrity. Not the buildings, but the belief that every person deserved a home, every worker deserved fair wages, and every community deserved development that enhanced rather than extracted. Thomas Reed had died a secret trillionaire, but he had lived as a humble janitor because he understood that identity came from what you did with your life, not what you possessed. His son had spent 30 years proving that his father's vision could transform the world, but he had done so while living in a 3-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn because he too understood that wealth was a tool, not a destination. And somewhere, in whatever realm exists beyond this one, Thomas Reed smiled at his son's persistent refusal to be corrupted by the very wealth he wielded so powerfully for good. And he knew that his 40 years of patient, invisible, revolutionary work had not been in vain.